welcome everybody and good afternoon to our GDPLive inflation tracker launch. I know this is an unbelievably busy time of the year, so thank you for being here. When I thought we don't have to think about COVID anymore, I've received a total of 10 apologies just this morning of people saying, unfortunately, I've tested positive, or my partner tested positive, so I can't come, which unfortunately included a few of our data partners, because we wanted them to be here to say thank you as well as KPMG couldn't be here, but I see PwC is here attending, so obviously the guys with the bigger buildings attend more events, so that's good, thank you for that. So first of all, thank you for being here. It's also a pleasure to see people without masks and actually be with people. We have been teaching online, and I always say I'm better with real people than on a screen. Especially I can't throw things at people or my students when they are not in the room with me, but when I see them dozing off, I normally have a marker flying through the lecture theatre. Now, she had tough rules. I was educated in Germany, so there's a certain level of discipline that... exactly, that's good. Now, inflation has been the hot topic in economics globally, and I'm not sure how many of you will remember a time when all the big powerhouses were hovering about the 10% in inflation mark. So if that's happening, then we know there's a bit of trouble. And even our, what used to be called the rock solid economy is heading that way. So it's an important issue. We also know inflation is happening because every time we go to the supermarket and you realize that now a single tomato is like $1.50 and this tiny little lettuce is $6.50. So you realize prices are going up. But it's not just the prices that hurt you, but also the coinciding interest rates that tend to go up when inflation goes up. So if you managed to fix your mortgage 3 years ago, you'd probably fixed it at 2.5%. If you have to refinance it now, and I see a few worried faces over here, if you have to refinance it now, you'll be probably looking at 5.5%, 6%, so more than 2, almost 3 times what you used to pay. So that hurts. Now, what is really annoying, frustrating, and creates anxiety is the fact that we actually don't know what inflation is today. The government told us back end of September it was 7.2%. And the Reserve Bank indicated that might have been the peak and things are doing better. But unless we actually know what inflation is today, we have no idea whether we are going down, up, steady, and so on. And this is exactly to help with that frustration why my very small team at the Knowledge Exchange Hub here at Messi decided we need to create a live inflation tracker so that everyone can go online and check every day what inflation is. Now, this was not an easy job. It involved long days, evenings, weekends, and a few more grey hair over the last couple of weeks, definitely. So it's time to introduce my very small and very capable team, which consists of 3 people in total. So you've known me. I actually haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Christoph Schumacher, in case you don't know me yet, and I'm Professor of Innovation Economics at Messi University. Now, the second key partner in crime, is Dr. Theo Schuschnigg. He has placed himself nicely right at the back, but you'll see him later on, and he is with the School of Mathematical and Computational Science at Messi, and then we have Peter Horn. Peter, over there, he's a master student in that school, and the 3 of us are effectively what GDPLive or the inflation tracker is. So I wasn't kidding when I said that we are a very small team, but times are tough at universities, so we are, that's all we get. And we even decide to build the website ourselves with YouTube videos. It's amazing what you can learn from YouTube. So what I'm going to do is first provide a little history of GDPLive so you can place it into the right context. Then we'll listen to our 3 fabulous panelists, and I'm absolutely delighted and excited to have all of those you guys here today, making a big effort Oliver came in from Wellington, Hilmare came in from Wellington just to be here with us, and I'm very pleased to have a nice balance of a spectrum of opinions, and I will introduce these guys later on. And Oliver, right now I apologize that looking from the audience, you sit quite to the left. That might be an unfamiliar situation more, but we'll get to that later on. After the panel discussion, we open the floor for a few questions, and then I will ask Theo to sort of lift the lid a bit of that black box that is GDPLive and provide some insights before we launch the new tools. And when I say launch, we actually do this here because at the moment everything runs on a test site that nobody has seen. And after this event, we will go live with that site. So you guys will be the first to see this. And of course, there's a lot of anxiety about things that can go wrong with a website that is powered by a lot of data running through. So fingers crossed it will work all right, and if not, well, we gave it a shot. All right, so let's provide a bit of a background of GDPLive. It all started about 8 years ago on a visit to the University of Chicago when I spoke with a few colleagues, and we spoke about how important GDP still is as a snapshot of the health of our economy. And then we quickly spoke about the fact how frustrating it is that it takes governments 3 to 6 months to tell us what GDP actually is. Imagine you go to your doctor for your annual health check and your doctor tells you 6 months ago you were healthy. You'd probably say that it's very nice, but how about today? This is what I want to know. Am I healthy today? So when I came back, I started talking to Theo and said, Theo, what can we actually do? Any ideas? And we said, yeah, it will all start with data, lots of it. Live data, everyday data, and a variety so that we can derive GDP from it. So spent a year knocking on doors, and everybody said, yeah, you want our data? You're right. Sort of that TUIAD that always used to come up at that time. But after a year, we had the first company to say, you know what? We'll provide daily data for you. We'll send it, build a data pipeline, and off it goes. Once we had the first, the second, and third came along, until we finally had enough data to actually produce models, to produce an algorithm, and start to measure GDP as it happens now. Once that was done, we launched GDPLive in December 2018, providing not just a national value, but a regional value, and for 16 different industry sectors. And since we went live, we have regularly, consistently outperformed the Reserve Bank forecasts, as well as any of the commercial forecasts, including some banking forecasts. Right? So we were rather pleased with that. Since we went live, we have had just over 5.2 million page views. Now I know in the commercial world it's small, but believe me, for academics to know that our research has been viewed 5.2 million times is more than we hoped for. So now that we've done this, we thought, hey, we need to ease the frustration on inflation and do exactly what we did for GDP for inflation as well. So people can go online and see GDP is here, inflation sits there. But we didn't stop there because we thought what matters is not just inflation, but that mortgage rate that we need to pay and the link to the OCR. So after some stimulating discussions with Oliver, we came up then with the idea, okay, why don't we measure using a Taylor rule of what the optimal OCR in New Zealand actually should be, and how big the gap between that optimal value is and our current OCR. And that rule takes into account things such as the output gap from employment to productivity to the current OCR, inflation targets, and so on. So we have added these two tools as well. So later on you will see an inflation value, a Taylor OCR optimal value, and a gap value. And believe me, you'll be surprised at what you see, because until we actually looked at it, we couldn't believe what was going on. We did some recalculations, rechecking, and it is an eye-opener. So that's what's in store in the next sort of 50 minutes, and then we can all run and enjoy ourselves. More than enough from me. So let me introduce our three fantastic panelists. First is Oliver Hartwig. He is the CEO of the New Zealand Initiative and a very smart economist. We've known each other for a while. It was interesting discussions, very stimulating discussions. When I thought, how can I introduce him? I recalled that a good friend of mine, who is herself a very smart mind, said to me not too long ago that she listened to an interview of Oliver Hartwig and admitted she has a bit of a, I quote, a brain crush on him. How can I introduce this guy? Well, exactly. He is the guy other people have a brain crush on. So that's enough said about Oliver, and I introduce you to her later on. I do that. Then our second panelist is Helmere Schulze from Böll. Thank you so much for coming. We actually haven't met until today, but she is a fellow columnist at the NBR. So there we've got something in common. And she was willing at reasonably short notice as well to come to provide her views. And finally, and he might probably not need an introduction because many might have heard of him or met him, is Laurie Kubiak. He is the chair of the Taxpayers Union and the CEO of Nortec. And in his previous and also director at North Power, I believe, and also used to be the CEO of NZIER. And what excited me the most is of the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra. So what a well-rounded person and the level of expertise. Now I've asked my three panelists here to give us about roughly a 9 minute and 10 seconds, German, we are precise, view about how the rising inflation impacts on New Zealand, the economy, on people and businesses, and whether real-time data actually would make a difference and it is helpful. So I now switch my microphone off. Hand this over to Oliver. So we'll start from there to there. I wasn't going to say from the left to the right, so from here we go.
I feel totally at home on the left. Thank you. I like the idea of the brain crush. I have to think about it a while. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here to launch GDPLive, because I'm a great fan of GDPLive and have been for a long time. So when Christoph asked me whether I'd like to say a few words, of course I accepted straight away. Except I'm not going to stick to the script. So I want to reflect on a few things here. First, this project, of course, is just one application of artificial intelligence. And there are so many around us today, and I think it is worth reflecting on that, what that means. I'm not just an economist, I'm a great techie, I'm a great believer in tech, and I find all of these movements super interesting, except some of them I still don't understand. I'm so glad I didn't do this NFT craze. We would have lost a lot of money. And I'm still not quite sure whether I believe that cryptocurrencies are the future, even though I lost a lot of money with Bitcoin. But certainly AI applications I use on a daily basis. And we use them actually at the New Zealand Initiative to improve our writing. So when you read our articles and you think they're particularly well written, chances are an editor, actually an AI editor, would have made it sound better, because we use about 5 different software packages. We pass all our writing through, and in the end we sound intelligent. So that helps. But anyway, that's just a snapshot. I mean, AI is all around us. I had a column in the Herald just a few weeks ago discussing what this will do to graphic design. I'm not sure how many of you have used softwares like DALL-E 2 or Midjourney. It is absolutely phenomenal what these softwares can do. We've actually now designed our first report covers with artificial intelligence. You can find them on our website. Have a look. So this is just another application of AI. So the idea, you take an awful amount of data, pump this into your system, and let the software then tell you what it finds out and what regularities there are. And therefore, I think this whole approach of GDPLive and InflationLive is absolutely stunning. And it's probably just the beginning of what we can see in data analysis and economics. And okay, we've now got GDP figures on a daily basis. We've got inflation figures now. We can now calculate the Taylor rule in real time. Who knows what else we will be able to calculate, probably in just about 6 months, given your output. Perhaps we can even estimate unemployment in the future. Maybe we can do even more. This whole idea of the Taylor rule came out of a discussion we only had last week, and now it's integrated into the data, into the website, which we can see later. So what Christoph and his team are doing here, I think, is path-breaking. I've never seen anything like this anywhere in the world. This is really a world first, and we should be proud of that. We should be proud of that as New Zealanders, that this is starting here. A bit like what Bill English did with the integrated data infrastructure, of course, when he integrated all the government's databases into one. And you can do fantastic work with that too. And actually, we have done it at the initiative. But the problem with both your project and ours and Bill English's is that we might have these path-breaking ideas and we have world-first projects and world-class opportunities, but sometimes we are the slowest to realize that in New Zealand. So I've known from conversations with Christoph that you found a lot more interest sometimes in your work and in your outputs and how these models work overseas than even here. And I know from conversations that you have been approached by Asian governments who would like to replicate something like GDPLive in their countries, when you've been trying to pitch your ideas to domestic institutions like the RBNZ, and they said, oh, that's very interesting, in a very New Zealand way, and then nothing followed from that. So I think we have to have a wider conversation on what we can do with our most high-tech innovations in New Zealand. We are very good at actually getting to that first stage, having brilliant ideas, having great people, developing the stuff, getting it to a point where we can demonstrate its usefulness. And then, typically, we're looking for funding elsewhere. And what happens often enough is then that these projects wander overseas because there you can find people who are just a little bit more enthusiastic about it and probably also more willing to finance this. So if there's one wish I have for all of you tonight, is to think about how we can help projects like GDPLive actually find and secure funding. Because without funding, the best ideas are not going to last much longer, and they will probably emigrate and leave New Zealand like so many other great ideas before. So this is my encouragement. I would like to see more of that. Now on the application of the Taylor rule, on inflation tracking, on GDP tracking, what I can say just from, as a practitioner of economic data basically, from that perspective, it's a bit like thinking back to the time before GPS and before Google Maps. You remember, if you're old enough, when you were going to a foreign place, foreign country, and you were stuck and you didn't quite know where you were, you had to drive a bit longer until you came across some kind of landmark, until you could see a street name at least, and then you could find them in the map, and then you knew that you'd been going in the wrong direction for the last half an hour. And then you turned around. And in a way, what we're doing with economic data today is something just like that. So we haven't got the live data, so we have to wait and wait and wait and wait until Stats NZ tells us what it was about half a year ago. And then we realize actually half a year ago we should have made a different call when it comes to, for example, the cache rate, the RBNZ sets. So a bit like what Google Maps did for us, a bit like what GPS did for us in navigation, this is exactly what GDPLive does for economic policy making. You would have seen today that the Reserve Bank finally gave us a report on their performance in monetary policy over the last few years, and of course, unsurprisingly, they have basically ticked all the boxes in their own view and have done a fantastic job. But there is at least this tiny little bit of an acknowledgement that the Reserve Bank says, well, actually with better data, we could have probably made better decisions earlier on. So the Reserve Bank is still not willing to take any blame for any of the things they've done, but they say if we'd had better data, we probably would have come to better conclusions. Which in a way must sound a bit ironic to your ears, because you've offered them your data. They could have had all of this data if only they'd listened. So that makes it a bit ironic just watching these debates. Now on the Taylor rule, I've wondered for a long time why no one has ever put this together in a more systematic way. I'm a great fan of the Taylor rule. I've actually met John Taylor a few times because we're members of the same club. I think I first met him at a conference in Hong Kong in 2014. And he gave a passionate speech on rules-based monetary policy, just to make monetary policy that little bit more predictable. And especially over the last few years under Governor Orr, I often thought back to that speech from John Taylor, and I thought, well, that would be the solution to many of our problems, to get a bit more predictability and rules-based thinking into monetary policy in New Zealand. So what was missing from all of that was, of course, having the live data to make this worthwhile, because there's no point actually calculating the Taylor rule if it only tells you what he should have done about half a year ago. So when Christoph then mentioned where he got to with GDPLive, I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity now to actually put this into effect for monetary policy tracking. So what you can do is, once you've got all the data and you've got them live now, you can calculate right now what the Taylor rule would say the OCR should be. And I think it took about half a minute to convince Christoph to add this to the website, and the results, but I'll leave that to you to introduce them later, are absolutely stunning. And I may just conclude by saying that, having thought about it, especially in the context of Adrian Orr's reappointment this week, I would have been far happier if GDPLive had been appointed governor of the Reserve Bank. We could have just taken the Taylor rule, we could have taken the value of the Taylor rule, and that would be our OCR. That would make it extremely transparent, it would make it very predictable, and we would finally have a rational Reserve Bank governor. Thank you very much.
So, I would say I think having an AI as a Reserve Bank governor would scare the bejesus out of me. I don't think that, I think having some human interaction and some logic in our system would always be welcomed. Although I do think having great data is specifically a starting point. In my business, data is our life. This is what we do. An economist would call statistics our pornography, and it is the area of focus. Integrated data infrastructure from the government has been a significant improvement in terms of having access to data. I do agree that once it gets to something innovative like this, we are not very good at integrating that. But we as a country are also not very good at integrating innovation and supporting innovative people and supporting innovative industries to grow within New Zealand and not bugger off. So I think for me, if we look at this and the impact of inflation currently, we know has been really, really hard on households. We know it's not been hard only on lower income households, but actually wealthy households as well. I saw a lot of nods when we were talking about the interest rates. But I do think that having real life data will make policy decision making better. Because if you look at a policy decision making cycle, if we stick to a formula, the thing is you have a research question, you gather the evidence to be able to enable you to make a good policy decision. So this is where the data is very important. And we have some short-term pressures. We have cost of living pressures in New Zealand that we have to address now. It doesn't matter who's in charge. We have to address it. And there are some tools and vehicles that the government can currently use to do that, which includes working for families, energy. There are quite a few of those. But to be able to target them more realistically, it would be great to have a real-time tool to be able to say, this is where the pressure is, let's tackle this. But again, monetary policy in the OCR is not a magic bullet. It has never been a magic bullet. Currently with inflation, that's the entire focus is on the OCR, because that's going to fix our country. It's not. We have some long-term structural issues that we need to address. And the power tool in that is productivity. And the power tool in that productivity is we are, and there's huge debate around, are we a low-income economy or not? Yes, we are. So wages and salaries is where the focus should be, as we should create in the next 10 years, because we know the next economic shock is coming in 10 years' time, because the one before this was the GFC, 10 years before that was the Asia financial crisis, 10 years before that was the oil shock. So it's not a surprise. Every 10 years we have an economic shock. It changes supply or demand, but it's coming. So how do we ensure that in 10 years' time from now, you have households that can actually weather this? And the way to focus on that is to focus on our productivity. And it's always been a conundrum for us. And it's also looking at income, salaries and wages. In companies today, salaries and wages are seen as a cost. It is actually an investment. So we should flip this around by saying, if you increase salaries and wages, you will actually increase productivity. So if we start looking at this long-term structural changes, that can be influenced by having more data, creating this, what we call a data lake, to be able to make intelligent decisions. But for the short term, having data available to make sure that the pressures that we have at the moment on households, that we can actually address those. Because having an OCR going up and up and up is not going to help households to be able to alleviate the cost of living pressure at the moment.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, first of all. I don't often venture north of the bridge, I must say. I live in Mellons Bay and work in East Tamaki, so every time I come up here, I'm struck. There always seems to be more business park and more buildings going up. It's a real growth area, and it's fantastic to see. Hilmare started by voicing a point of disagreement with Oliver, so I think I should return the compliment in a way by voicing a point of disagreement with her, and it's on the point of productivity. And I have a real recent incident that I can speak to on this. The productivity increases come first, because before you join the wages, before you raise the wages. I bought a company. It's the one that Christoph mentioned at the beginning, called Nortec, which is an electronics manufacturer, high-tech electronics manufacturer in East Tamaki. And one of the first things I did was to set up a special project, which I call Project Rocket, because demand for what we were doing was going up like a rocket. So I said, let's have Project Rocket to work out what that means for production. How can we hit these levels month after month without breaking a sweat? And so that was Project Rocket. Well, it worked, and we had the biggest month we've ever had in September of this year. And so when we did that, we went back, we checked all the metrics, and we said, yes, our productivity has increased. We can do a wage round now. And we've just done that. And I do believe that's the way it has to happen. The productivity increases come first. The other way around gets you into trouble. But Christoph mentioned that it's my great privilege, actually, to be involved in a number of businesses. So I mentioned Nortec just now, but I also do a bit of governance around the place. So I see lots of different businesses and different industries. So manufacturing I've just mentioned, but I'm also on the board of New Zealand's largest, in fact, electrical subcontractor, so in the energy industry. I chair a board in financial services, the taxpayers union Christoph has mentioned, so all different sectors and different scales from, I think, 18 people up to 1,400 for North Power. And bringing the conversation back to inflation, inflation matters to all of those industries, and not just for the obvious ways, for the ways that it would matter to your treasury policy, because you don't want the reserves that you're holding to be inflated away. You've got to do obvious things there. And again, there's the obvious relationship with interest rates, which I'll return to in a moment. But it matters because it affects the people, as Hilmare has just said, in those organizations. And you look at the characteristics of your workforce, you look at what they're being paid, you look at the pressures they're under, you look at the competitive pressures that you're under, and you just work out how inflation plays into all those dynamics, and you work out what you can do. So you might be lucky to be operating in a sector where there's it's not particularly price sensitive, your final demand. So if you make increases in wages to your people, you can pass those on, but you mightn't have that luxury. So if I think of two of my organizations, one is absolutely in that position. It sells into sectors that couldn't be less price sensitive, and it's a great blessing. But another one, has a very large regulated return component to what it does. That's obviously the energy one, the electricity one. And so we don't have the sort of freedom of maneuver that you might expect. So we look at what inflation is doing to our people in that particular industry, and we say, well, what can we do if it's not wage increases? And there are things we can do that sort of substitute for the spend that they would otherwise incur. So one thing that we're looking at the moment, just within these four walls, is offering medical insurance to all those people, so they're not inhibited in going to the doctor. That's not a pay increase, but it's something meaningful to them and to their families. And what informs your decision making in those business decisions as well is inflation. And as several people have said, inflation now, not just inflation now, what is it today at this very moment, but how is it traveling? Is it accelerating? Is it decelerating? And if so, in what direction? So it's very valuable to have a tool like this that can inform you of those things. The relationship with interest rates is obviously highly relevant to business as well. In many industries, it's the normal practice in New Zealand. I think I've seen some information from BDO that bears this out, to finance industrial plant using bank finance, because it's hard to do it through cash reserves, and actually it's quite advantageous if you do it by taking out a specific loan for the purpose that you can apply against that asset. That's going to get harder as inflation rises. Obviously, people will be more inhibited in taking and making those decisions to invest in their capability. And that really brings me on to my last point, which echoes one of Oliver's, which was the importance of AI and data generally in decision making today. So I'll illustrate this. Christoph told me to speak as a businessman, not as an economist, so I'm trying to do that. But I'll return to Nortec, which, as I said before, is a high-tech manufacturing business. It's an easy claim to make, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean to be a high-tech manufacturer in electronics? Well, again, something that we did earlier this year is we contacted a body in Singapore that assesses all the manufacturers across the world against a set of criteria which are called the Industry 4 criteria. So that's the advanced manufacturing criteria, and it just looks at those criteria and says, how far behind the best in breed on all those 18 things are you? So a bunch of homunculi came up from Singapore and put us through hoops of fire. The outcome of that process was that we're in the top 5% of the world. So 80 people in East Tamaki are in the top 5% of the world for manufacturing electronics. I mean, that's amazing for New Zealand. What's the why? How has that happened? And essentially, it's because if you look at those Industry 4 criteria, they are all data-driven. They're all AI. The Industry 4 criteria depend on all the machines in your system, in your manufacturing system, talking to each other. We call it human by exception processing. And the same is true of the robots that we use in production. We try and take all the human error out of it and run the businesses on the numbers, as we say. And I think that's actually true of almost all businesses. All businesses have to be run on the numbers. And that's certainly what we do at Nortec. We scrutinize all these things day after day, month after month. And through doing that, that's how we're able to stay afloat and stay competitive against some pretty aggressive competition from East Asia. That's who we compete against. It's China, it's Thailand, it's Indonesia. And that's how we stay afloat and manage to survive and thrive. So AI, data, nowcasting, having real-time information that you can react to in real time, that you can course correct against in real time, is of the utmost importance in business. And through the Surrey assessment exercise that I mentioned just now, we also had the opportunity to benchmark ourselves against the other New Zealand companies in the set. And that was the big differentiator. The people who had invested in this kind of world were doing well. The others were struggling in various ways. So I absolutely endorse the not only the product, but also the process to achieve the product. I think what you've done here is fantastic and of immense value to businesses up and down New Zealand. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. That was very insightful, and I love to get different views up here, different perspective. Now, I know as these events are always a bit pressed for time, but we do have a few minutes for audience questions. So if anyone has a question, Stuart, I wasn't not surprised here. Thank you. And I'll pass the microphone back.
A question that's rule-based, which you might like. If we think back 1990, that was when the first major rule that the Reserve Bank started to apply in its remit, and that was a cap on inflation of 3%. And we've seen now, over 30 years, just about every other central bank in the world adopt the same 3% arbitrary rule. What's magical about 3%, please?
Anyone wants to?
Actually, I think the first iteration of the rules from the 1990s was 0 to 2%. The 3% came later. That was a later target. There is nothing magical about it. I think the only point about setting a number somewhere in that region is to limit central bankers and politicians from committing some mischief. So you keep them, you give them at least a boundary for their mischief. There's nothing magical apart from that. There are other financial rules where you can probably find a stronger rationale for a specific number. So I'm thinking of the rules set down in the Maastricht Treaty for the euro, where they had some rules on deficits, some rules on total debt. The problem with all of these rules is, of course, that nobody ever played by them. But rules-based decision-making is not such a bad idea, and especially when it comes to monetary policy. So basically, let's talk about the Taylor rule a bit. So if you're familiar with the Taylor rule, you know that John Taylor actually set out in the 1990s to not prescribe what central banks should do, but to replicate their decision-making. So what he tried to do was he tried to figure out how central banks with a stability target were actually in real life setting their rates, and he tried to replicate that in a formula. He did that, by the way, at the same time as Warwick McKibben did at the ANU, and the two effectively invented this Taylor rule together, even though Taylor is the only one who could name it. But the idea was to just based on empirical research replicate decision making, and what they then found was, hey, this works so well, why can't we use this as a prescriptive tool? So where we say, okay, central banks, if you want to target whatever it might be, 1%, 2%, 3% inflation, we've got a formula, you put all your economic data into that, and we tell you where the OCR should be based on your target. And I think that has certain advantages because it takes the guesswork out of it. I mean, currently we've got a whole industry of economists, bank economists, busy trying to figure out where central banks are going to go. I think in Soviet times we used to call this Kremlin astrology. Remember when we try to figure out what's happening there and what they're thinking? Well, that's happening with our central banks, of course. But once you've got a rule in place, and especially if it's a rule based on live data, anyone could go on the website and would have a rough idea where the central bank would end up. You would probably, and that's where I agree with you, leave a little bit of a human factor in all of this, because a Taylor rule is very good for ordinary times. When the world comes to an end, or when it threatens to come to an end, as with a pandemic, you would probably still have to adjust a bit. If the economy is about to fall off a cliff, then all your kind of previous guesstimates about output gaps and so on don't tell you much. And then you would need to reserve the flexibility to deviate from the Taylor rule. But really, we're talking about extremely exceptional circumstances. For your ordinary kind of central banking needs, a Taylor rule is what I would prefer to the kind of activism that we got from the Reserve Bank over the last couple of years.
I don't know if this was the reason back in the early 90s, because I was very young then. But it might have been an empirical test. I mean, maybe you guys know, but since I think the war, GDP growth in developed economies is typically 2.5%, 3% per annum, in that range, and maybe that was the basis of the benchmark setting. I don't know if that's the case, but it would make some kind of loose intuitive sense.
Anyone else with a question? Don't be shy.
Thanks, Christoph. Hey, so probably this is directed at you, Christoph, but I'm interested in the panel. So you've got the GDPLive today. You're about to go with interest, the inflation adjuster. So that's the Quinella. What's the trifecta? What comes next?
We leave this for the next presentation when Theo comes to talk, and then we'll take some more questions back then. So anyone else oh yeah, here was a turn your
Yeah, sorry. I'm interested how, in the world right now we talk about, employment and unemployment, and that there's a worldwide, shortage of skills. What I struggle with is that before COVID, there were hundreds of millions of people creating a workforce. Hundreds of millions of people didn't just drop off the edge of the earth. What gives? And then the second part to that is when we're talking about employment and unemployment, do we actually have to live, and if so, why, with the percentage of
population being unemployed, and why is that?
I'll pick up the first one of those. The short answer is we're all in a global competition for people at the moment, everywhere. And what we've done over the last few years is made it difficult for people to come here. We've actually lost people. So in the year, I think it's August to August, the last year, we lost 11,000 people, net loss to New Zealand, so it went away. And that's Kiwis as well as people who are passing through. Now that doesn't sound like a big number, but when you reflect that over the last 15 years, I think the largest net increase we had was just under 60. Actually, it's a pretty significant number. If that continues for 2-3 years, whatever the period is, you are looking at a significant drain. So, you know, we've locked down our borders more harshly than other countries have, and we're still not making it easier for people to come here or to stay when they remain. I told Oliver an anecdote when we were chatting beforehand about, I had 2 guys, excellent guys, Indians, electrical engineers, both been with Nortec for some time, a couple of years, they're not fly-by-nighters. They were trying to bring their wives into New Zealand. It was just taking so long that in desperation, if that's the word, one of them applied to Canada and got a visa in 2-3 days flat, like that. So his mate saw that and did the same thing, and he's in Canada now. This is in the last 2 months. You know, that's how hard we've made it for people to come here. So I think we just need to get real. You know, we do need a liquid labour market in New Zealand. We need people coming in and leaving, and we need the policy settings to deliver that to us. We can't grow our own quickly in every space. That's the brutal truth. Anybody else?
So we are a nation of migrants, just listening to the accents in the panel. 1 in 4 people in New Zealand were born overseas, and we have shut that tap in the last 2 years, which had a significant impact on our economy. And if you look at the current situation and the current immigration issues we do have, it will hamper our growth, our productivity for the next 5 to 10 years if we do not fix this. In terms of unemployment, you will always have people in unemployment that are either transitioning between jobs or don't have a specific fit for the market. So you'll always have that. Currently, it's slightly masked by job seeker support, and we do think that there needs to be some serious looking at some of the policies around people on job seeker support and where they should actually fit and what that should look like. We also have NEET, which is not an education employment, but those numbers also mask, you know, when you have a young girl who is, say, 19 and she just had a baby, she's on the NEET statistics. She shouldn't be there. No, she had a baby. She should be at home looking after her kids. So it's also looking at our data and making sure that we actually, over time, improve our data and data collection to make better decisions.
Maybe I should reframe my question. What I'm saying is that internationally there is a worldwide case to be rules and issues, not just in New Zealand. What I'm not understanding is where did all the people go? That's what my question is. It's not just New Zealand, it's because I'm very familiar with what you're saying about our situation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Compare our policy with Australia. They're incentivising people to go to Australia. You know, sweeteners, you know, work for a certain amount, sell back, pay you extra money. All the stuff, we're not doing any of that stuff. The Canadians do exactly. They're actually incentivising people into poverty.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything you've said on migration, totally d'accord. On your question, well, that's the puzzle of our times. It's the same story wherever you look. It's the same story in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, for slightly different reasons. I mean, our migration settings are particularly bad, but the other countries have got problems too. I can only give you a theory. I would like to actually have this tested. Well, the first factor is obvious. The first factor, I think, is that we disrupted practically every market in the last couple of years because of COVID. So if you were a pilot and your airline doesn't fly anymore, well, you find yourself a different job, and then you actually find that maybe the working hours are more pleasant and you like your new job and you're not coming back to become a pilot afterwards again. And that is probably the experience that many people have made in many, many different jobs, and it's just that kind of disruption which is really hard to unwind. first factor. But the second factor is the one that I would like to have tested. And that is, I suspect, looking at the amount of liquidity created by central banks around the world over the last couple of years in response, that we have systematically overstimulated our economies. And you can see this. We have created so many jobs in the economy now, based on cheap money, that these new jobs created have sucked labor out of the rest of the economy. So we've actually probably overstimulated our labor markets to the point that now everybody's scrambling to get people into their companies because we have created way too many jobs. And one of the factors that I think will play out now in the coming global recession is actually that we'll get back to a more normal and more sustainable level of employment, which will mean that a lot of the jobs created with cheap central bank money over the last few years will now disappear, to the point that labor markets get back into a balance. And I think that's going to be extremely unpleasant, but I look forward to some proper, decent economic analysis of that development.
Is that the second part of my question? Do we have to accept, and that's a question that no politician would ever want to answer, a certain percentage of the population must lose beyond.
We've got a bit of a response from the Reserve Bank on that. So our Reserve Bank now admits quite openly that the second target, the second mandate they have on long-term sustainable full employment, or whatever it's worded these days, is overachieved. So they say that actually we are beyond maximum sustainable employment, which is another way of saying actually a lot of people will have to lose their jobs until we get back to the point where it's sustainable.
I make an empirical point in support of all of it. Where has that money gone that we've been printing? A lot of it's gone into the government sector. That sector's expanded 40% over the last 5 years. It might even be a bit more now. I'm seeing this again in one of my organisations, which is quite heavily regulated. It's in the financial services sector. And when we look at the churn in our labour force over the last 18 months, those people are going to the regulator at much higher salaries. So they're going for higher salaries in the public sector than they were seeing in the private sector, where we're subject to all kinds of constraints. And on top of that, the system in Wellington at the moment is it's not actually hard to get extra heads. All you do is you write a case for change for some extra heads, and some taxpayers' dollars turn up, and there you go, you're master of all you survey, which is not really the reality in the commercial sector, but that is the world that we're in at the moment. It's the public sector that has expanded enormously, fueled, I would suggest, by the situation exactly as Oliver has described. I would love to see that examined rigorously as well.
Thank you, guys. Due to our usual time constraints, and we still have the second main event coming, meaning the launch of our website, I'd like to thank you guys. Put your hands together for what was it? After we've launched the site and Theo has given some insights, there will be plenty of time to enjoy the food, the catering. It's always tempting seeing it there. So if you do have more questions, I'm sure these guys will be happy to answer them. So thank you, guys. If you want to take a seat in the front row, then I'll start to move those chairs away and hand over to Theo. Now, when people hear AI, they think of this black box. Something goes in one end, something else comes out at the other, and we have no idea what's happening in between. Now, this is true in some aspects, not completely. So I'll ask Theo to sort of let you have a look under the hood of what GDPLive, or now the inflation tracker, is and what drives our results. So this is not some wild guesswork. And once he's given you some insights into that, we actually show you the 3 new tools we have: the inflation tracker, the tailor-based OCR value, and then the gap between the OCR and our tailor rule. And then we'll have some more questions if you have them, and then we'll finish for the evening. So let me now hand over to Theo, and let's get this thing going.
Thanks, Christoph. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along, and thanks for sticking around to the end as well. Appreciate it. So I've got 10 to 15 minutes, and what I want to try and achieve in this presentation is give you a non-technical but still a sufficiently informative presentation on what Christoph said is happening under the hood. There are 4 things I want to cover. First one is data. What is fueling the inflation tracker? What drives it? Number 2, does it work? How well does it work? Is it accurate? Number 3, I want to use some latest AI tools that we have that kind of open up the black box that drives this predictive model to see, can we understand how the model behaves? What drives its predictions? And fourthly, we'll do the demo and we'll have a look at what we've actually done on the website. So the first set of design decisions we had to make was around data. And there are a few constraints we had to satisfy. The first one is obvious. We had to find data that was correlated with inflation. But beyond the obvious, we had to find data that had enough coverage. What I mean by that is we needed to find data points that went back far enough in time so that we could actually extract patterns, look at the correlations between inflation and the data, and extract those patterns. Once we acquired all of the data, then we combined it, experimented with about a dozen machine learning algorithms, and we selected the best one, which created our forecasting model. So the forecasting model is based on historic data, but the ideal is, and this is what we've been talking about tonight, is can we get real-time data? And there was a third constraint about our data. Not only did we need data that was historic, we needed to find data that we could actually get hold of in real time right now. Because the purpose is to feed that data into the forecasting model so that we can actually come up with a forecast. So that's the overall architecture of the system. What are the data sources that are fueling the inflation tracker? There are 3 broad categories under which we categorize all the data sources. The first category describes what the current pressures are on the supply. So for that, we relied on our data partners, Port Connect being one of them, who manage ports of Auckland, as well as Port of Tauranga, imports and exports. Now, chiefly what we were interested in is data that was coming into the country, so imports data. And we were trying to track and see, what is the momentum doing? What's the trend? Are we getting more cargo coming in? Is it slowing down? Now, obviously, that covers 2 regions of New Zealand, and what we're hoping to do is fill in the gaps. And this is where we relied on our other data partner, and that's KiwiRail. And what we tried to do with KiwiRail data is look at where are all the ports around the country, and then see if we could quantify all the cargo coming out of the ports destinations across the rest of the country and see whether or not there's momentum changes in that data. Lastly, down at the bottom, we found an interesting data source. The New York Fed recently released an index that measures the global supply chain pressure. And it's up to date. So we integrated that as well. The second category of data is data points that tell us something about prices in New Zealand. So for that, we relied on our other data partner, Worldline, formerly known as Paymark. So Paymark produces those FPOS machines that we use all across the country, tens of thousands of them. So they have a pretty good sense of how much money is going through the New Zealand system. We were looking again to see what is the momentum happening in terms of spending, in terms of prices there. Petrol was another one that we get from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And lastly, some generic economic drivers as well. And for that, we looked at bonds and exchange rates, which we get from the Reserve Bank. So conventional thinking is, as bonds go up, expectation is that the inflation is going to go down and vice versa. That's the conventional thinking. Our models seem to think differently. And the other one with exchange rates, the thinking is, well, if the exchange rate goes down, if the dollar weakens, the imports get more expensive, so that drives up inflation. Lastly, we looked at New Zealand commodities. So New Zealand commodities, we kind of lumped them together, talking dairy, we're talking fisheries, forestry, and so forth, looking at the price index that is tracked by Stats New Zealand. So we clumped that up into one single signal, and that is essentially our data inputs for the model. So like I said before, we trained our model, and we tested on the data. How well did the model do? So here it is, warts and all. You can see when it performs well and when it performs poorly. So what are we looking at? So the data range we're looking at is from 2010 to current third quarter. We trained our model on data starting from 2010. So this isn't all the inflation movements over time. We trained it all the way up to here. And then you'll see various dots around the graph. The red ones are predictions. They're the forecasts made by our model. The blue one is the baseline. So whenever you're making a forecast, you need to kind of compare it against something, some sort of a baseline, so you know, is the model doing anything useful or not? Is it better than baseline? And in this case, we're using a very naive baseline, which is essentially trying to predict the next quarter with what happened in the previous quarter. So it's not very intelligent, but despite that, it's usually very hard to beat the benchmark, the baseline models. So we can see that during the more stable period, forecasts are not too bad. So if we go into this graph, we kind of zoom in, we can see where the forecasts are doing okay. But it's this spike here that was really, really hard to learn and for the models to capture. So we see that, so this was second quarter of 2021. In the third quarter, it struggled. It was quite off. But then it started to adjust and learn as more data came in. And now it's not too bad. It's overshooting a little bit, but all in all, it's pretty good. Well, how much better is it than the benchmark? We find that it's 24% better than the benchmark. So we're happy that the model is doing something. It's better than the benchmark. And we're also confident that we can continue to tweak it and improve it. Now, next question is, how does the model work? What drives the model? So here I'm going to show you a graph, and this is created by these, what I find quite exciting, AI new tools. This opens up the black box algorithm and tells us what drives the forecast. So what are we looking at? On the y-axis over here, we've got the names of the variables, of the features. So we've got exchange rate lag 3. What that means is we're actually using the lag, the 3-month lag of the average exchange rate. We've got the value of 1-year bonds, the imports momentum, so this is the port connected data, the imports that come into New Zealand. We've got the New Zealand Commodity Index. This is the global supply chain pressure index we're getting from the States. The average petrol price, this is the spending momentum coming in from Worldline data, as well as the Kiwi Rail tonnage. The second y-axis is a color gradient. Whoops. And this is going from low values to high values. Now, this relates to the values of each one of the features. So this relates to the data points of each one of these features on this axis. The last component I want you to fix your eyes on is this central component here, this vertical line here. What that means is that any point that lands to the right of that line is having a positive impact on forecasting higher inflation. Likewise, anything that falls to the left is predicting a lower inflation. It's pushing it down. Now, as we get further and further away from that vertical line, the greater the magnitude of the impact onto the forecast. So let me try and interpret the first line for you, given this color gradient. As the exchange rate increases, the effect on predicting low inflation rates also increases. As the exchange rate lowers, as the dollar gets weaker, in reverse, we see inflation forecasts being pushed up. 1-year bonds, this is a curious one that I'd actually like a little bit of interpretation from the experts, because we've scratched our heads around this one. It's behaving differently to what we would expect. So as the value of 1-year bonds increases, we're seeing the inflation being pushed up by the forecasting models as well. But the effect is asymmetrical the other way around. So as the 1-year bonds decrease in value, the effect is negligible in terms of pushing the forecast value down. Now we see similar effects with the other features, and you can see the magnitudes of the effects that each one of those features has on the overall forecast. Okay, so this is the behavior of the model at a very, very high level. But can we do more? Can we actually try and explain how the model reasons when it tries to predict the inflation rate for one particular quarter. So here I'm going to show you what's happening for first quarter of this year. The actual inflation was 6.9, and our model predicted 6.7. No, it's not too bad. Now ignore the numbers on the x-axis. I just want you to look at the colors and the size of these bars, because that tells you what is really driving the forecast for that particular data point. And this is extremely important because a lot of modeling goes on these days where you're just given a number, but you've got no idea what's actually driving those forecasts. So this kind of technology brings in transparency into the whole process. And this is something we're going to try and publish on the website every single month. So we can see for the first quarter, the most impactful data point was the disruption in the global supply chains. All right, so that was having by far the biggest and most eclipsing effect. The second one that was pushing the inflation downwards was the fact that the spending momentum had slowed down. Okay, and the other effects were a little bit smaller. Another example, this is the most recent data point that we have, that we know, 7.2 was inflation for the last quarter. We overshot it with 7.6, but you can see how the picture changes. The underlying landscape had changed, and so different factors influencing the forecast, pushing, forcing the final forecast in different directions. Okay, now let's get to the fun stuff. What's inflation doing right now, and can we explain it? So what we're going to do now is feed in the real-time data into the model and see what we come up with. And this is what we're predicting. So this is today's date. We don't know what the official inflation figure is, obviously. What we're predicting is 7.3. So we're not predicting a slowdown at the moment. What's driving it? Well, look at this. The model is picking up a real strong slowdown in the imports. And that's eclipsing everything else. So the commodities are pushing things up, as is the exchange rate, which is weakening. Well, 3 months ago it was very weak. The bonds as well. But it's really this part here that's kind of pushing things down, but it's not pushing them down enough to actually be lower than 7.2, which is the last quarter. Yes? Yeah. I'm using the exchange rate provided by the banks. I'm not sure which one it is. I don't think it's trade weighted index. No, it's not. Yeah, correct. Yeah. So the next steps. So Christoph said that there are things in the works. We do want to refine our tracker version. This is 1.0. We're working towards smaller increments. We're going to try out new features, and we're going to play around with new data points as well. But when it comes to version 2.0, we're making plans for doing something a little bit different. We want to track inflation in real time using a slightly different approach. And so what we want to do is we'll open up communications with foodstuffs, and what we'd like to do ultimately is get hold of their data so we can see how the price of food has been changing over time and use that as an additional calculation. And what we also want to do, and we heard from Stats New Zealand that this is something that we're really after, is a regional inflation tracker. So I think if we manage to get that kind of data, we should be able to drill down into that granularity as well. So I'll leave Christoph to say thank yous, but I will give you guys the demonstration of the website. So as Christoph said, this is running on our test server. As soon as we finish, Peter's going to deploy this onto our live server. On our live server, which is here, scroll down, it says coming soon, so you won't be able to see anything to do with inflation at the moment. But these are the things that we have added. So we've got our inflation tracker here, where you will be able to see a similar graph that I showed you before. You will see exactly how far off our forecasts have been. And you'll see where our current forecast is here. Zoom in. Whoops. right? So you'll be able to see that current forecast is 7.3. And Oliver Hartwig talked a lot about the Taylor rules, so we're going to get there. And this, I almost think, is the most exciting part of this whole thing. The next graph is actually showing us what the current OCR rate is and what we're calculating that it should be using the Taylor rule. And in order to sort of amplify the gap and make things kind of hit home a little bit stronger, we've generated another graph that shows the actual gap, which you can see is at unprecedented levels. And we've also put a little bit of a commentary in here to signify what were some of the key events happening at different points in time, which I think makes for interesting reading. So I'll close there and open it to you guys for any questions if you have any.
Now, I also don't want to stand in the way between some lovely food that has been piled up over there and drinks. So we are very close to the end of this. Are there any pressing questions you would like to ask us right now? Except that unprecedented rise in our difference between where the OCR should sit and it is. Someone from the back.
Yeah, when you see the sort of like, so now that you've got this, where's the gap between having this and like government accountability, like institutional accountability to start using it?
That is unfortunately not for us to say, but the question was, now that we know about these things, where's the accountability? Is it something we can hold politicians, Reserve Bank governors and so on accountable for? Well, the least we hope is that it will stimulate a discussion, and when we approach the Reserve Bank yet again, that maybe this time around they might show more interest. There will be a few interviews coming, podcasts coming, now that this will be released into the net. We hope it will stimulate some discussions, and that's really the most academics can ask for. We do the research, and often we sit in our offices and do this. It's now time to publicize this, to get it out in the open, and if it stimulates discussions, then this is fantastic. We are not judgmental here, because we are researchers. All we do is draw attention to certain issues and say, this is now available, please use it. The site is free to everyone, right? GDPLive.net, go on it, and you get everything we've just shown you is right there. So let me just, at the end, say a few huge thank yous. The first goes to our data partners. Without them, none of this would be possible. You had no idea how excited I was after a year of knocking on doors until the first said yes. So there's Worldline, formerly known as Paymark. We have Port Connects. We have Kiwi Rail. We have Steel and Tube. We have TradeMe, who's helping us out, and we have the NZTA. So thank you to those guys. Data is very precious and valuable. For you to share this every day with us means you trust us with what we do. So thank you. It would not have happened with any of these data partners. It simply wouldn't have happened. A second thank you goes to Massey University, because over the last 6 years they have funded GDPLive with $1.25 million over those 6 years. Now, life at universities is tough at the moment because we have been operating without international students for several years now. So to get that kind of funding over such a period of time was absolutely fantastic. So I thank Massey University. Our Vice Chancellor wanted to be here. He couldn't make it because there are some major issues with employment and union meetings and so on. So I think he was held up. But thank you to Massey University. Thank you also to Amazon Web Services, who just last month started crediting us back our hosting costs. And that is fantastic because every little thing matters. So long may this relationship last for many months and years to come. So thank you to AWS for helping us along and supporting the startup-driven initiative. Then a quick thank you to Desley Jameson here from Upengadi. I've only met her about a month ago or so at an event. She was that excited about GDPLive that instantly she was available for advice, helping me to publicize this, connect me with businesses, something that we at universities are very poor of, connecting with businesses, but something she's very good at. And above all, she said, made a substantial financial contribution to our project to keep us going. You have no ideas how often I've asked and begged and crawled and nothing has happened. To meet someone at an event who instantly says, you know what, I put my money where my mouth is and I'm going to support you. So thank you, thank you. I need more people like this. This is for sure. Then also a thank you to BNZ for hosting us here tonight. This is a fantastic and lovely venue. And they are putting on the drinks and the food, so thank you. And they were an absolute pleasure to deal with. And Alicia, thank you for putting up with us and our demands. It was a lovely venue to be. Thank you to the person at the camera, who tends to be my oldest son, who filled in at very short notice because we needed somebody to do that job, and we had literally a zero budget. When I asked the university, they said, a bit troublesome, so it's all working well. Hopefully, I'll watch the video later on, and then I'll tell you how happy I am. And finally, thank you so much to our three panelists. It wouldn't have been the same evening without you. So thank you for your valuable insights. There's a bottle of wine and a box of handcrafted chocolates waiting for you. Now, I had these handcrafted chocolates sitting on my desk for the last 2 days, and I thought maybe I should use them as a live application on inflation. There were 12 chocolates in the box. Maybe inflation happens, you only get 11 chocolates for the same amount of money, and another hour later, and there were only 10 chocolates in the box. This is how inflation hurts us all. So, got no idea how tempting it was. So, thank you so much for being here. It's lovely to see so many supporters of GDPLive. So please go on the website and use us. And before you start the run to the buffet, just something in our own interest. Our agreed funding for GDPLive will come to an end at the end of this year, effectively next month. And in the current environment, it would be unfair to ask Messi for any more support. They have done their stint, and there are other colleagues who now need their projects funded. So it's time for GDPLive to stand on its own feet. This, however, means I need the support of people like you, the businesses you link with, those 5.2 million people who have viewed GDPLive, who nevertheless is still the world's first and only. There's no other country who has this. It's fantastic that we are all proud of what we have achieved, but if I don't find any funding and support, this won't be available in the next years. If in any way you feel this is something my business would like to support or be a part of, please talk to me. I have plenty of business cards. I'll make sure you get to know me, and then we talk about how to include you in the GDPLive family. So we are doing this. We have done this often at night, weekends, as a kind of a hobby, which it not really is, but it tends to be. If people like it, if people use it, then please talk to me, and we'll make sure that we have many more years and many more additional features to add to GDPLive. I see this as a big puzzle, and we needed to add more and more pieces. On that note, more than enough from me. Thank you so much for being here. It's lovely to see you all and actually fill up all the chairs. I was getting a bit worried after the 10th apology came in with people related to COVID, so it's not just good that you're interested, that you physically were able to make it here. And now, enjoy the wine, drink, I certainly now will, and the plenty of food that is sitting at the back of the room. Thank you so much. And another big thank you for my little team, Theo and Peter, who sits over there with a big smile on his face. That's what I like to see. So thank you guys, and enjoy the food.